London, 1817. The year when Napoleon's shadow finally retreated from European shores, when the British Empire stood triumphant, and when the rigid hierarchy of English aristocracy reached its most glittering and merciless peak. Within the marble halls of Mayfair mansions and the crystal ballrooms of Grosvenor Square, a world existed where a single whispered rumor could elevate a family to the heights of power or condemn them to social extinction. The Georgian architecture of London's most prestigious addresses stood like monuments to order and tradition. Each townhouse, with its perfectly symmetrical windows and imposing columns, represented not merely wealth, but the unshakable belief that society's carefully constructed pyramid would endure forever. Inside these palatial homes, beneath frescoed ceilings and beside roaring fireplaces carved from Italian marble, the true rulers of England conducted their business with the precision of military strategists and the ruthlessness of ancient emperors. Lady Evangeline Ashworth moved through this world like a perfect porcelain figure come to life. At 24 years of age, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that poets attempted to capture in verse and painters struggled to immortalize on canvas. Her auburn hair, always arranged in the most fashionable style of the day, caught the light from Venetian glass chandeliers like liquid fire. Her emerald eyes, fringed with dark lashes, seemed to hold secrets that could topple kingdoms. When she walked through the grand reception rooms of Ashworth House, her silk gown rustling against marble floors, servants bowed their heads not merely out of respect for her title, but from an instinctive recognition of someone who wielded power with deadly grace. The Ashworth family had held their position among England's most influential dynasties for over 3 centuries. Their wealth, built upon vast estates in Yorkshire and shrewd investments in the growing Industrial Revolution, provided them with the financial foundation necessary to maintain their social supremacy. But money alone could never have secured their place in the intricate web of aristocratic power. That required something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous: information. Lord Reginald Ashworth, Evangeline's father, understood this fundamental truth better than most. As the 4th Duke of Ravenshollow, he had spent decades cultivating relationships with everyone from cabinet ministers to merchant princes. His library, lined with first-edition volumes bound in Morocco leather, served as an unofficial seat of government where policies were discussed and fates decided over glasses of aged brandy and plates of finest French delicacies. The Duke's influence extended far beyond the borders of his Yorkshire estates. His recommendations could secure military commissions, his disapproval could end political careers, and his friendship was sought by everyone from ambitious young lords to visiting foreign dignitaries. Evangeline had been groomed from childhood to navigate this treacherous world with the skill of a master diplomat. Her education had been comprehensive and exacting. French and Italian languages spoken with perfect accent, pianoforte played with professional expertise, watercolor painting executed with artistic precision, and dancing performed with such grace that even the most cynical observers were moved to genuine admiration. But beyond these traditional accomplishments expected of a lady of her station, Evangeline possessed something far more dangerous: an intellect sharp enough to cut through the elaborate facades that surrounded her, and an intuitive understanding of human nature that allowed her to see the hidden desires and secret fears that motivated even the most powerful individuals. The grand ballroom of Ashworth House, where tonight's reception was being held, represented the pinnacle of Regency elegance and sophistication. Crystal chandeliers, each containing over 500 individual pieces of hand-cut glass, cast dancing rainbows across walls adorned with silk wallpaper imported directly from France. The floor, constructed from alternating squares of black and white marble quarried in Italy, reflected the light like a frozen lake. Along the walls, portraits of previous Dukes of Ravenshollow gazed down with expressions of dignified authority, their eyes seeming to follow the assembled guests as they moved through their elaborate social rituals. The guests themselves represented the very cream of English society. Ladies glided across the marble floor in gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, their necks adorned with jewels that had once graced the throats of queens, their fans fluttering like exotic butterflies as they whispered behind delicately gloved hands. Gentlemen in perfectly tailored evening dress discussed matters of state and business with the casual authority of those accustomed to having their opinions translated into immediate action. The very air seemed thick with privilege and power, perfumed with the scent of rare orchids arranged in crystal vases and the subtle fragrance of expensive French soaps and English rose water. But beneath this glittering surface, Currents of tension and intrigue flowed like underground rivers. Every smile concealed calculation, every compliment carried hidden meaning, and every conversation served multiple purposes beyond mere social pleasantry. The Ton, as London's high society was known, operated according to rules more complex and unforgiving than any legal code. A single misstep could result in social death, while the right alliance could open doors to unimaginable influence and wealth. Evangeline understood these rules better than most, having observed them from birth and participated in their intricate dance for over 6 years since her official presentation to society. She knew that her own position, secure as it might appear, depended upon maintaining the delicate balance between revealing enough of herself to seem genuine while concealing the aspects of her nature that would shock even the most worldly members of her circle. For Lady Evangeline Ashworth harbored secrets that would not merely damage her reputation, but could potentially bring down the very foundations of the social order that had nurtured and protected her family for generations. In the privacy of her opulent bedchamber, behind walls covered in hand-painted Chinese silk and beneath a ceiling decorated with scenes from classical mythology, Evangeline maintained a leather-bound diary that contained truths more explosive than any political scandal or military intelligence. Written in her own elegant handwriting, using ink made from the finest ingredients available, these pages chronicled not merely the events of her daily life, but the hidden thoughts, forbidden desires, and dangerous knowledge that she had accumulated through years of careful observation and strategic relationships. The diary itself was a work of art, bound in the softest Moroccan leather and secured with a lock crafted by London's most skilled metalworker. Its pages, made from paper of such quality that each sheet felt like silk beneath the fingertips, contained confessions that could destroy marriages, topple political careers, and expose the carefully concealed corruption that festered beneath the polished surface of England's most respected institutions. But more than that, these pages contained evidence of Evangeline's own transgressions against the moral code that governed aristocratic society, revelations that would mark her not merely as a fallen woman, but as someone who had deliberately chosen to reject the values that her class held most sacred. The first entry in the diary had been written on the evening of her 18th birthday, when she had attended her first official court presentation and witnessed the Byzantine complexity of royal protocol. The Queen herself, resplendent in diamonds that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, had received the young ladies being presented with a mixture of maternal benevolence and calculating assessment. Each curtsy was evaluated, each gown examined, and each family background silently catalogued for future reference. But what had shocked Evangeline was not the ceremony itself, but the conversation she had overheard between 2 cabinet ministers who believed themselves unobserved in an alcove behind the throne room. They had been discussing the sale of military commissions to the highest bidders, regardless of the candidate's qualifications or character. Young men whose only recommendation was their family's wealth were being placed in positions of authority over experienced soldiers, while officers who had distinguished themselves in battle were being passed over for promotion because they lacked the financial resources to purchase advancement. The ministers spoke of these arrangements with the casual indifference of merchants discussing the price of grain, showing no concern for the lives that would be lost as a result of their corruption. That first revelation had opened Evangeline's eyes to the true nature of the world she inhabited, and it had inspired her to begin the systematic documentation that would eventually fill hundreds of pages with evidence of systematic corruption, hypocrisy, and moral bankruptcy among the very individuals who claimed to represent the highest values of British civilization. Each subsequent entry had added another layer to her understanding of how power truly operated in their society, how wealth was accumulated through exploitation and manipulation, and how the elaborate codes of honor and virtue that governed public behavior served primarily to conceal the ruthless pursuit of personal advantage. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Evangeline's private sitting room, casting geometric patterns across Persian carpets that had been gifts from grateful foreign ambassadors. She sat at her writing desk, a masterpiece of English craftsmanship constructed from rare birds, maple and inlaid with mother-of-pearl, contemplating the events of the previous evening while sipping tea from a porcelain cup so delicate it seemed to glow with its own inner light. The tea itself, a rare blend imported from the mountains of Ceylon, had been specially prepared by her ladies made according to a recipe that had been perfected over generations of service to the Ashworth family. Evangeline's morning routine was a carefully orchestrated symphony of luxury and tradition. Her chocolate-colored hair had been brushed exactly 100 times with a silver-backed brush that had belonged to her grandmother, then arranged in a simple but elegant style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. Her morning dress, sewn from the finest Indian cotton and trimmed with handmade Belgian lace, fit her figure perfectly while maintaining the modest appearance that propriety demanded for daytime wear. Even her jewelry had been selected with meticulous care, a single strand of pearls that had been in the family for 3 generations, and earrings crafted from emeralds that exactly matched the color of her remarkable eyes. But despite the familiar comfort of these morning rituals, Evangeline's mind was occupied with matters far more complex than the selection of appropriate accessories or the planning of her daily social obligations. The previous evening's reception had brought news that would require careful consideration and even more careful action. Lord Marcus Blackwood, the Earl of Thornwick, had returned to London after 3 years of diplomatic service in Vienna, and his presence in the city would inevitably complicate the delicate web of relationships that Evangeline had spent months carefully constructing. Marcus Blackwood represented everything that was both magnificent and dangerous about the English aristocracy. Tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that he wore slightly longer than current fashion dictated and grey eyes that seemed to see through every polite facade, he possessed the kind of masculine magnetism that made even the most sophisticated ladies lose their composure. His family's wealth, derived from extensive holdings in coal mines and textile mills, provided him with financial independence that few of his contemporaries could match. But it was his intelligence and his complete disregard for social conventions that made him truly formidable. During his years in Vienna, Marcus had served as an unofficial intelligence gatherer for the British government, using his aristocratic connections and natural charm to penetrate the inner circles of European power. He had attended private dinners with Prince Metternich, danced at balls hosted by the Habsburg court, and maintained correspondence with political figures whose decisions affected the fate of nations. But more importantly, he had developed a network of informants and allies that extended from the drawing rooms of Austrian nobility to the coffee houses where radical intellectuals planned their revolutionary schemes. Evangeline had met Marcus 3 years earlier, just before his departure for the continent, at a soirée hosted by the Duchess of Marlborough. The attraction between them had been immediate and overwhelming, a connection that transcended the carefully regulated interactions that typically characterized relationships within their social circle. During the few weeks before his departure, they had conducted a romance that violated every principle of proper courtship while somehow managing to avoid the notice of London's ever-vigilant gossips. Their relationship had been conducted in the shadows between acceptable social behavior and outright scandal. Secret meetings in the conservatory of Ashworth House during her mother's afternoon tea parties, where Marcus would slip between the exotic plants like a ghost, his presence announced only by the subtle scent of his distinctive cologne and the almost electric tension that seemed to fill the air whenever they were in the same room. Stolen moments during crowded balls, when they would find themselves temporarily isolated by the movement of dancers, their conversations consisting of words that carried multiple meanings and glances that communicated desires that could never be spoken aloud. Most dangerous of all had been their correspondence, letters written in a code that they had developed together, using references to classical literature and mythology to disguise declarations of love and desire that would have shocked even the most worldly observers. Evangeline had kept every letter, hiding them in a secret compartment of her writing desk that had been constructed by the same craftsman who had built the hidden passages that connected various rooms of Ashworth House. These letters, written in Marcus's bold handwriting on paper bearing his family's distinctive watermark, contained enough evidence to destroy both their reputations if they were ever discovered by the wrong eyes. But Marcus's return to London represented more than simply the revival of a passionate romance. During his years abroad, he had discovered information that could potentially expose the corruption and hypocrisy that flourished in the highest levels of British society. His letters to Evangeline, carefully coded though they were, had hinted at discoveries that could bring down cabinet ministers and destroy the carefully constructed alliances that maintained the current balance of power. He had learned that certain members of parliament had been accepting bribes from foreign governments, that military contracts had been awarded based on personal relationships rather than merit, and that the very men who proclaimed themselves the guardians of British values had been engaged in activities that would disgrace common criminals. Evangeline realized that Marcus's knowledge, combined with the information she had accumulated through her own careful observations and strategic relationships, could create a weapon of unprecedented power. But wielding such a weapon would require careful planning and perfect timing. A single mistake could result in their mutual destruction, while success could potentially reshape the entire structure of English society. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside her sitting room interrupted Evangeline's contemplation. She quickly secured her diary in its hidden compartment and arranged her features into the serene expression that was expected of a lady of her station. Her mother, the Duchess of Ravenshollow, entered the room with a measured grace that had made her one of the most respected hostesses in London. The Duchess was a woman who had been beautiful in her youth and had evolved into something far more formidable with age, a presence that commanded attention and respect through sheer force of personality. Her silver hair was arranged in a style that emphasized her still striking bone structure, and her morning dress, while appropriately modest for a woman of her years, was cut from fabric that probably cost more than most families spent on clothing in a lifetime. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world's hierarchy, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing of importance that occurred within her sphere of influence. The relationship between Evangeline and her mother was complex, built upon genuine affection but complicated by the fundamental differences in their approaches to navigating aristocratic society. The Duchess believed firmly in the traditional values that had sustained their family's position for generations: duty to one's class, adherence to established social codes, and the subordination of personal desires to the greater good of family honor. She had married the Duke not for love, but because it represented the most advantageous alliance available to a woman of her birth and accomplishments. Their marriage had been successful by the standards of their world, producing 2 healthy children and maintaining the financial and social stability that enabled the Ashworth family to thrive. Evangeline, however, had inherited her father's analytical mind along with her mother's beauty, and she had reached conclusions about their world that would have horrified the Duchess if she had been aware of them. Through years of careful observation, Evangeline had come to understand that the moral code that governed aristocratic behavior was largely a facade designed to conceal the pursuit of power and wealth. She had seen supposedly virtuous ladies conduct affairs with ruthless calculation, watched respected gentlemen ruin their competitors through deliberately spread rumors, and observed political leaders make decisions based entirely upon their personal financial interests while proclaiming their dedication to the national good. This knowledge had led Evangeline to adopt a philosophy that was both liberating and terrifying. If the rules of society were ultimately meaningless, then she was free to pursue her own desires and ambitions without regard for conventional morality. But this freedom came with enormous risks, because while she might choose to reject the hypocrisy of her world, that world would never hesitate to destroy her if her transgressions were discovered. The morning light streaming through her sitting room windows illuminated not merely the physical beauty of her surroundings, but the invisible web of relationships and obligations that defined her existence. Every piece of furniture had been selected not simply for its aesthetic value, but for its ability to communicate messages about the Ashworth family's status, taste, and connections. The Chinese porcelain displayed in specially constructed cabinets had been acquired through the East India Company's monopolistic trading practices that had impoverished millions of Asian workers. The Persian carpets beneath her feet had been woven by artisans whose governments had been destabilized by British diplomatic interference designed to secure favorable commercial treaties. Even her morning tea, served in cups that cost more than most families earned in a month, represented the fruits of a global system of exploitation that enriched a few hundred British families while condemning millions of human beings to lives of desperate poverty. The sugar that sweetened her drink had been produced by enslaved Africans working under conditions so brutal that death rates on Caribbean plantations exceeded birth rates, requiring constant importation of new victims to maintain production levels. The very cream that lightened her tea came from dairy farms whose owners had been granted exclusive grazing rights through parliamentary acts that had dispossessed thousands of small farmers and condemned them to lives of urban poverty. But perhaps most troubling of all was the realization that her own family's wealth and position depended entirely upon their participation in these systems of exploitation and corruption. The Ashworth estates in Yorkshire generated their vast revenues through coal mines where children as young as 6 years old worked in conditions that would have appalled the most hardened criminal. The textile mills that provided additional income employed women and children for 14 hours a day in factories where the air was so thick with cotton fibers that workers frequently died of lung diseases before reaching their 30th birthdays. The government bonds that formed the foundation of their investment portfolio had been purchased using money that the Treasury had borrowed to finance military interventions designed to protect commercial interests rather than national security. The weeks following Marcus Blackwood's return to London passed in a whirlwind of social events that provided perfect cover for the renewal of their dangerous relationship. The season was at its height, with barely an evening that did not offer multiple entertainments for the consideration of society's elite. Garden parties hosted in the magnificent grounds of great estates, where ladies in flowing summer dresses strolled beneath ancient oak trees while gentlemen in perfectly pressed linen suits discussed the latest political developments. Theatre premieres where the boxes reserved for the most distinguished families became stages for the display of wealth and influence, with occupants who were often more fascinating than the performers they had nominally come to observe. Private dinners in dining rooms that could have served as throne rooms for minor royalty, where conversations conducted over multiple courses of exotic delicacies would determine the fate of business ventures, political careers, and social reputations. Evangeline and Marcus navigated these events with the skill of master actors, maintaining the appearance of casual acquaintance while conducting a romance that grew more intense and more dangerous with each passing day. They had perfected the art of communicating through seemingly innocent interactions, a particular way of holding a fan that indicated a desire to meet privately, a specific arrangement of flowers in her hair that confirmed the time and location for their next rendezvous, a certain pattern of steps during a country dance that conveyed messages no observer could possibly decode without knowledge of their private language. Their secret meetings had evolved far beyond the relatively innocent encounters of 3 years earlier. The conservatory of Ashworth House, with its jungle of exotic plants imported from the far reaches of the British Empire, had become their private paradise where they could speak freely without fear of observation. Among towering palms from India and flowering vines from the Caribbean islands, they would spend stolen hours discussing not merely their mutual attraction, but their shared understanding of the corruption and hypocrisy that characterized their world. Marcus's experiences in Vienna had provided him with a perspective that few of his contemporaries possessed. He had seen how the great powers of Europe conducted their diplomacy, using a combination of charm, bribery, and barely concealed threats to achieve their objectives. He had attended meetings where the fate of entire populations was decided by men who had never set foot in the territories they were casually redistributing. Most importantly, he had learned to recognize the signs of systemic corruption, and he had been shocked to discover that the British establishment, for all its proclamations of moral superiority, was no different from the continental systems they claimed to despise. During one particularly memorable evening in late June, when the conservatory was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and illuminated by moonlight streaming through the glass ceiling, Marcus revealed to Evangeline the most dangerous knowledge he had acquired during his diplomatic service. He had discovered evidence that Lord Chancellor Pemberton, one of the most respected figures in the British legal system, had been accepting payments from a syndicate of merchants who were seeking favorable rulings in commercial disputes. The evidence was contained in a series of documents that Marcus had managed to obtain through his network of continental contacts, papers that detailed financial transactions and correspondence that would destroy Pemberton's career and potentially bring down the entire government if they were made public. But Marcus's revelations were only the beginning of an evening that would fundamentally alter the course of both their lives. Evangeline, emboldened by his trust and excited by the possibilities his information presented, decided to share with him the contents of her secret diary. By candlelight, in voices barely above whispers, she read to him selected passages that documented years of careful observation and strategic intelligence gathering. She revealed how Lady Catherine Fairfax, the wife of the Secretary of War, had been conducting a passionate affair with Colonel Harrison, the officer responsible for awarding military supply contracts, and how their relationship had resulted in grossly inflated payments to preferred vendors. She described the elaborate scheme by which the Duke of Wessex had been systematically embezzling funds from various charitable organizations, using his reputation for philanthropy to cover theft that had deprived the poor of London of thousands of pounds intended for their relief. Most shocking of all, she provided details of how members of Parliament had been selling their votes on crucial legislation to the highest bidders, treating their duty to the nation as simply another form of commodity to be traded for personal profit. Each revelation was supported by meticulous documentation. Dates, times, locations, witnesses, and financial records that Evangeline had acquired through a combination of careful eavesdropping, strategic friendships, and occasional outright theft. Her position as the daughter of one of England's most influential families had provided her with access to information that no journalist or government investigator could possibly obtain. Dinner conversations in her father's study, private letters carelessly left in drawing rooms during social visits, and whispered confidences shared by ladies who assumed that someone of her background would never dream of using such knowledge for improper purposes. As Marcus listened to these revelations, he began to understand that Evangeline had transformed herself into something unprecedented in their world, a woman who possessed the power to reshape the entire structure of British society. Her diary represented more than simply a collection of gossip and speculation. It was a comprehensive map of the corruption that festered beneath the polished surface of aristocratic respectability. But he also recognized that this knowledge came with enormous risks, because the individuals whose secrets she had documented would stop at nothing to prevent their exposure. The realization that they were both in possession of information that could topple the government led to a conversation about their future that lasted until dawn. They spoke of the possibility of using their combined knowledge to reform the system from within, carefully exposing corruption while positioning themselves to benefit from the resulting chaos. They discussed the option of fleeing England entirely, using Marcus's continental connections to establish new lives in Vienna or Paris where the knowledge could provide them with both wealth and influence. But underlying all their practical considerations was a deeper question. Having discovered the true nature of their world, could they ever again participate in its rituals without feeling complicit in its crimes? Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of approaching carriages in the courtyard outside. Dawn was breaking, and the household staff would soon begin their daily routines. Marcus departed through the secret passage that connected the conservatory to the news behind Ashworth House, but not before they had made a pact that would bind their fates together forever. They agreed to continue gathering evidence of corruption and hypocrisy, using their combined social connections to penetrate even deeper into the inner circles of power. But more than that, they pledged to support each other no matter what dangers their activities might bring, recognizing that they had crossed a line that made retreat impossible. The secret passage that Marcus used for his departure had been constructed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, when Catholic sympathizers had needed hidden routes to escape the persecution of Protestant authorities. The narrow tunnel, lined with stones quarried from the same Yorkshire estates that now provided the Ashworth family with their wealth, connected not only the conservatory to the news, but also linked the main house to a network of underground chambers that extended beneath much of Mayfair. These passages had been used by smugglers during the previous century, by Jacobite conspirators during the failed rebellion of 1745, and now by lovers whose passion threatened to destabilize the very foundations of British society. As Marcus disappeared into the shadows of the tunnel, Evangeline reflected on the irony that the same architectural features that had once protected religious dissidents were now sheltering political revolutionaries. The hidden chambers beneath her family's mansion contained not merely the evidence of corruption that she and Marcus had gathered, but also printing equipment that could be used to disseminate their discoveries to a wider audience. The types had been imported from France through a network of Republican sympathizers who understood that the exposure of aristocratic corruption could serve their own revolutionary purposes. The paper had been manufactured in mills owned by industrialists who hoped that political chaos would create opportunities for ambitious entrepreneurs to challenge the established monopolies that limited commercial development. The ink that would be used to print their revelations had been compounded according to a formula developed by radical pamphleteers during the American Revolution, a mixture that would resist both fading and chemical attempts at erasure. Even the binding materials had been selected for their symbolic significance. Leather from cattle raised on lands that had been confiscated from Irish peasants, thread spun in Scottish mills by workers whose families had been displaced by Highland clearances, and glue manufactured from animal products processed in London factories where industrial accidents killed or maimed dozens of workers every year. Every aspect of their conspiracy against the established order was itself dependent upon that same order's vast network of exploitation and oppression. They could challenge the system only by using tools and resources that the system had created through its crimes against humanity. This paradox would haunt their relationship and their mission, raising questions about whether genuine reform was possible within existing structures or whether meaningful change would require the complete destruction of everything they had known since childhood. The weeks that followed their midnight covenant were marked by a series of increasingly bold investigations that brought them ever closer to the most explosive secrets of their era. Evangeline began attending political gatherings as her father's representative, using her remarkable memory and keen analytical skills to document conversations that revealed the true motivations behind public policies. Marcus expanded his intelligence network to include disgruntled servants, ambitious younger sons of noble families, and foreign agents who were eager to obtain information about British government operations. Together, they uncovered evidence of a scandal that dwarfed anything they had previously imagined. The Prince Regent himself, the future King George IV, had been secretly negotiating with representatives of foreign powers, offering to influence British policy in exchange for personal financial assistance to cover his enormous debts. The negotiations had been conducted through intermediaries who included some of the most respected names in English society, men and women who had risked treason for the promise of royal favor and financial reward. But as their knowledge grew, so did the danger they faced. Their activities had not gone entirely unnoticed, and individuals whose secrets they had uncovered were beginning to suspect that someone was systematically gathering evidence against them. Anonymous letters began arriving at Ashworth House, warning Evangeline to cease her inappropriate curiosity about matters that did not concern her. Marcus reported being followed by men whose professional demeanor suggested they were not common criminals but agents employed by someone with significant resources and government connections. The autumn of 1817 brought with it an atmosphere of growing tension that seemed to permeate every level of London society. The leaves in Hyde Park had turned to shades of gold and crimson that reminded Evangeline of the blood-red ink she had begun using in her diary to mark the most dangerous revelations. The fashionable world continued its elaborate dance of social events and political maneuvering, but beneath the surface, currents of suspicion and fear flowed like underground rivers threatening to burst their banks and flood everything in their path. Evangeline's morning routine had evolved to include precautions that would have seemed paranoid just months earlier. She now varied the times of her daily rides in Hyde Park, taking different routes and employing different grooms to make surveillance more difficult. Her correspondence was conducted using multiple codes, some of which she shared with Marcus while others remained her exclusive secret. Most importantly, she had created multiple copies of the most incriminating pages from her diary, hiding them in locations throughout London that only she knew, ensuring that her evidence would survive even if her original journal was discovered and destroyed. The catalyst for the crisis that would test every aspect of their relationship and their commitment to their dangerous cause came in the form of a letter delivered to Ashworth House on a grey October morning when fog from the Thames had transformed the familiar streets of Mayfair into an alien landscape of shadows and half-glimpsed figures. The letter bore the seal of Lord Chancellor Pemberton, the very man whose corruption Marcus had first exposed to Evangeline during their midnight conversation in the conservatory. The message was brief but unmistakably threatening. Pemberton requested a private meeting with Evangeline, ostensibly to discuss a matter of mutual interest concerning charitable work in the East End of London. But the formal language of the invitation contained subtle implications that no member of aristocratic society could mistake. This was not a request that could be declined without consequences, and the subject matter would extend far beyond any discussion of philanthropic activities. Evangeline understood immediately that her activities had finally attracted the attention of individuals powerful enough to pose a genuine threat to her safety and that of her family. Pemberton's position as Lord Chancellor made him one of the most influential figures in the British legal system, with connections that extended from the highest levels of government to the shadowy networks of informants and enforcers who maintained order in London's criminal underworld. If he had decided that she represented a danger to his interests, he possessed both the authority and the resources to destroy her through legal means or, if necessary, through methods that would leave no evidence of his involvement. But rather than responding to this threat with the caution that prudence would have demanded, Evangeline chose to meet danger with an audacity that reflected her complete transformation from the obedient daughter of aristocratic privilege into something unprecedented in her world. A woman who refused to be intimidated by men who believed their power made them invulnerable to consequences. She accepted Pemberton's invitation but added conditions that demonstrated her understanding of the game being played. The meeting would take place at Ashworth House, in her father's study, with her family's solicitor present to ensure that proper protocols were observed. She also arranged for Marcus to be hidden in the priest hole that had been constructed behind the study's fireplace during the Catholic persecutions of the previous century, a hiding place that would allow him to witness whatever transpired while remaining undetected. The evening of the meeting arrived with a storm that seemed to reflect the dramatic tensions building throughout London. Rain lashed against the windows of Ashworth House while wind howled through the streets with such violence that even the most experienced coachmen struggled to control their horses. But despite the weather, Lord Chancellor Pemberton arrived precisely at the appointed hour, accompanied by a retinue that included his private secretary, two men whose appearance suggested military or police backgrounds, and a gentleman whose identity was concealed beneath a traveling cloak that he declined to remove even after entering the warmth of the Duke's study. Pemberton himself was a man whose appearance had been carefully crafted to inspire both respect and fear. Tall and imposing, with silver hair that gleamed like metal in the firelight and dark eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings, he possessed the kind of presence that made even powerful men feel uncertain and defensive. His evening dress was impeccable, cut from the finest materials and fitted with a precision that emphasized his still impressive physique despite his 60 years. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having his words treated as law, but there was also an undertone of menace that suggested he was equally comfortable with more direct forms of persuasion. The conversation began with the elaborate courtesies required by their social positions, but it quickly became apparent that Pemberton had not come to engage in diplomatic niceties. After dismissing the Duke's solicitor with a combination of legal technicalities and barely veiled threats, he confronted Evangeline with evidence that demonstrated just how thoroughly her activities had been monitored. He knew about her secret meetings with Marcus in the conservatory. He had obtained copies of several pages from her diary, apparently through the betrayal of someone within the Ashworth household. Most dangerously, he had intercepted correspondence that revealed the extent of their intelligence-gathering network and their plans to expose the corruption they had uncovered. As he spoke, laying out this evidence with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury, Evangeline realized that she was facing not merely exposure and social ruin, but potential charges of treason that could result in imprisonment or even execution. But Pemberton's revelations also contained information that transformed the entire situation from a personal crisis into something with implications for the future of the British Empire. The mysterious gentleman in the traveling cloak was revealed to be Colonel Morrison, the head of a secret intelligence organization that reported directly to the Prince Regent. Morrison's presence indicated that Evangeline's activities had attracted attention at the highest levels of government, and that her knowledge was considered valuable enough to justify extraordinary measures to obtain or suppress it. The true purpose of the meeting became clear when Pemberton presented Evangeline with a choice that was designed to seem generous while actually being completely coercive. She could surrender all copies of her diary and cease her intelligence-gathering activities in exchange for immunity from prosecution and the promise that her family would be protected from any consequences of her actions. Alternatively, she could face immediate arrest on charges of sedition and treason, with the understanding that her father's position and wealth would not protect her from the full severity of the law. But Pemberton's offer contained a third element that revealed the true extent of the government's desperation to control the information she had gathered. If she agreed to work as an agent for Colonel Morrison's organization, using her social connections to gather intelligence on behalf of the Crown rather than for her own purposes, she would be richly rewarded and given access to resources that would make her one of the most powerful individuals in London. In effect, they were offering to transform her from a threat to the establishment into one of its most valuable assets. Evangeline's response demonstrated the courage and intelligence that had enabled her to survive in a world that offered no protection to women who challenged its fundamental assumptions. Rather than accepting or rejecting Pemberton's offer immediately, she demanded time to consider the proposal and insisted on guarantees that her decision would not be influenced by threats against her family or Marcus. She also made it clear that any agreement would need to recognize her value as a partner rather than treating her as a subordinate whose cooperation could be taken for granted. The negotiation that followed revealed the complexity of the political situation that had created this crisis. The British government was facing challenges that threatened the stability of the entire empire. Revolutionary movements in Ireland and Scotland, economic instability caused by the transition from wartime to peacetime production, and growing dissatisfaction among the working classes who had borne the costs of the Napoleonic Wars while seeing little benefit from victory. In this context, the corruption that Evangeline had documented was not merely a moral problem but a potential source of weakness that foreign enemies could exploit to bring down the government. At the same time, the individuals whose crimes she had exposed were not random criminals but integral parts of the system that maintained British power. Removing them suddenly could create chaos that would be far more dangerous than allowing their corruption to continue. What the government needed was not exposure of the truth, but someone who could use knowledge of the truth to maintain control while gradually implementing reforms that would address the most serious problems without destroying the entire structure of authority. The decision that would determine not only Evangeline's fate but potentially the future of the British Empire could not be made in a single evening, regardless of the pressure that Pemberton and his associates were prepared to apply. The meeting in the Duke's study concluded with an agreement that provided Evangeline with 48 hours to consider the government's proposal, during which time she would remain under discreet surveillance but would not be arrested or otherwise molested. In exchange, she promised not to flee London or attempt to publish any of the information contained in her diary. But even as she agreed to these terms, Evangeline was already implementing a plan that she had developed during the months of growing tension that had preceded this confrontation. Marcus, hidden behind the fireplace throughout the meeting, had heard every word of the negotiation and understood that their situation had evolved beyond anything they had previously imagined. The choice they now faced was not simply between exposure and concealment, but between becoming agents of the very system they had sought to reform or accepting exile from everything they had ever known. The 48 hours that followed tested every aspect of their relationship and their commitment to the principles that had guided their dangerous investigations. They met in a series of locations throughout London, each chosen for its symbolic significance as well as its practical security. The library of the Royal Institution, where they discussed the moral implications of their choice while surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, where they contemplated the eternal consequences of decisions made in the temporal world. The ruins of an ancient Roman amphitheater discovered during construction in the city, where they considered how many previous civilizations had faced similar moments of crisis and transformation. During these conversations, they explored options that ranged from the practical to the fantastical. They could accept the government's offer and attempt to reform the system from within, using their new positions to gradually expose and eliminate the corruption they had documented. They could flee to America, where Marcus's connections in the diplomatic community could provide them with new identities and the opportunity to build lives free from the constraints of aristocratic society. They could even consider the possibility of revolution, using their evidence to expose the government's crimes while rallying support from the growing movements for democratic reform. But underlying all these discussions was a more fundamental question about the nature of power and the responsibility that came with knowledge. Their investigations had revealed that the British Empire, for all its claims to moral superiority and civilizing mission, was built upon the same foundations of corruption and exploitation that characterized every other great power in history. The wealth that supported London's glittering society came from the labor of slaves in Caribbean plantations, the profits of the opium trade in China, and the systematic looting of India's ancient treasures. The men who proclaimed themselves the guardians of Christian virtue were the same individuals who had grown rich from enterprises that violated every principle of human decency. This knowledge created an obligation that could not be ignored or rationalized away. Having seen the truth about their world, could they continue to participate in its rituals without becoming complicit in its crimes? But at the same time, was it possible for two individuals, regardless of their knowledge or determination, to transform a system that commanded the loyalty of millions and controlled resources that dwarfed anything available to private citizens? The crisis deepened when Marcus received information from his continental contacts that transformed their understanding of the government's offer. The intelligence organization that Colonel Morrison represented was not simply a domestic security service, but part of a broader network that included similar organizations in Austria, Prussia, and Russia. These agencies cooperated in suppressing revolutionary movements and maintaining the stability of the conservative alliance that had emerged from the Congress of Vienna. By accepting Morrison's offer, Evangeline would not merely be serving British interests, but contributing to a system of international repression that extended far beyond England's borders. This revelation coincided with the discovery that their activities had inspired others to begin their own investigations into government corruption. Young clerks in various ministries, motivated by patriotism and outrage at what they had observed, were beginning to document evidence of the crimes that Evangeline and Marcus had first exposed. Reform-minded members of Parliament were quietly building coalitions to challenge the most egregious abuses of power. Even within the military and the diplomatic service, officers were beginning to question orders that seemed designed to serve private interests rather than national objectives. The realization that their work had already begun to inspire a broader movement for reform provided Evangeline and Marcus with a third option that they had not previously considered seriously. Rather than choosing between collaboration and exile, they could choose martyrdom. By refusing the government's offer and accepting the consequences, they could transform themselves into symbols of resistance that would inspire others to continue the work they had begun. Their sacrifice would demonstrate that there were still individuals in British society who placed principle above personal safety, and their example might provide the moral foundation for a genuine reform movement. But the price of this choice became clear when Evangeline received a message that revealed the true extent of the government's willingness to use ruthless methods to protect its interests. Her younger brother Charles, who was serving as a lieutenant in the Royal Navy aboard a frigate stationed in the Mediterranean, had been arrested on charges of insubordination and conspiracy. The charges were obviously fabricated, but the message made it clear that Charles's fate depended upon Evangeline's cooperation with the government's demands. The psychological torture of this situation was exquisite in its cruelty. Charles was completely innocent of any involvement in Evangeline's activities, having been at sea for over a year and possessing no knowledge of her intelligence gathering or her relationship with Marcus. But his arrest demonstrated that the government was prepared to destroy anyone connected to her if she refused to submit to their control. The choice was no longer simply between her personal freedom and her principles, but between her family's survival and her commitment to reform. Marcus, recognizing the impossible situation that Evangeline now faced, offered to sacrifice himself to resolve the crisis. He proposed to surrender himself to the authorities, confessing to crimes that would absolve her of responsibility while providing the government with a scapegoat whose punishment would satisfy their need to demonstrate the consequences of challenging their authority. His offer was motivated not only by love for Evangeline, but by his understanding that she possessed resources and connections that made her more valuable to the reform movement than he could ever be. But Evangeline rejected this proposal with a vehemence that surprised even Marcus. She had not spent years accumulating dangerous knowledge and developing networks of allies only to abandon the field when the battle reached its most critical phase. Instead, she proposed a strategy that would require courage, intelligence, and perfect timing, but which offered the possibility of achieving their original objectives while protecting both her family and their allies. Her plan was elegantly simple and devastatingly dangerous. She would appear to accept the government's offer while actually using her new position to accelerate the exposure of the corruption she had documented. By becoming an agent of Colonel Morrison's organization, she would gain access to information and resources that would enable her to build an unassailable case against the very individuals who believed they had recruited her as their ally. The key to success would be patience and perfect dissimulation, allowing her enemies to believe they had neutralized her while she prepared to destroy them. The final confrontation that would determine the fate of the British Empire began not with armies marching or cannons roaring, but with the subtle click of a pen against parchment as Evangeline signed the document that officially made her an agent of His Majesty's most secret intelligence service. The ceremony took place in Colonel Morrison's private office, a room so carefully secured that even the walls were lined with lead to prevent eavesdropping by hostile agents. Present were only Morrison himself, Lord Chancellor Pemberton, and a clerk whose discretion had been guaranteed by methods that Evangeline preferred not to contemplate too closely. But even as she added her signature to the papers that bound her to serve the very system she had sought to destroy, Evangeline was already implementing the most audacious plan of her remarkable career. Hidden within the folds of her morning dress was a specially constructed device that would have impressed the most sophisticated intelligence operatives of any nation, a mechanical copying apparatus designed by the greatest clockmaker in London, capable of creating perfect duplicates of documents in a matter of minutes while leaving no trace of the original having been disturbed. The weeks that followed her official recruitment represented a period of intense activity that tested every aspect of Evangeline's intelligence and determination. Her new position provided her with access to government documents that revealed the true scope of the corruption she had previously only suspected. The file she was authorized to review contained evidence of treason that extended to the highest levels of the aristocracy, including members of the royal family who had been selling state secrets to foreign powers for decades. But more importantly, her access to Morrison's intelligence network allowed her to identify and contact other individuals within the government who shared her commitment to reform. She discovered that there were dozens of clerks, junior officers, and minor officials who had been quietly documenting evidence of corruption while waiting for someone with the authority and resources to take action. Through a series of carefully arranged meetings and coded correspondence, she began to organize these individuals into a coherent network capable of coordinated action. The breakthrough that would make her ultimate victory possible came when she gained access to Morrison's personal files and discovered that he had been secretly cooperating with foreign intelligence services, providing them with information about British military capabilities and diplomatic strategies in exchange for gold that he used to maintain a lifestyle far beyond what his official salary could support. The evidence was conclusive and devastating. Detailed financial records, copies of correspondence with foreign agents, and even samples of the special inks and papers that Morrison used for his treasonous communications. But Morrison's treason was only the beginning of revelations that would shake the foundations of the British government. Evangeline discovered that the intelligence organization he commanded had been systematically blackmailing members of Parliament, using information about their personal indiscretions to control their votes on crucial legislation. The network extended beyond politics into commerce and finance, with Morrison's agents manipulating stock prices and commodity markets to benefit their hidden masters while impoverishing honest investors and destroying legitimate businesses. Most shocking of all was the discovery that the Prince Regent himself had been an active participant in this web of corruption, using his position to facilitate Morrison's treasonous activities while sharing in the profits that resulted from the betrayal of British interests. The evidence included letters written in the Prince's own hand, detailing his knowledge of and approval for schemes that would have been considered treasonous if committed by any other citizen of the realm. Armed with this evidence, Evangeline began the delicate process of coordinating her exposure with allies throughout the government and society. Marcus, who had maintained his own intelligence network during the months of apparent separation, provided crucial support by ensuring that key documents were copied and distributed to multiple locations where they would be safe from government attempts at suppression. Reform-minded members of Parliament were quietly informed about the evidence that would soon be made public, allowing them to prepare legislation that could provide legal frameworks for addressing the crimes that would be exposed. The timing of the revelation was crucial to its success. Evangeline chose to make her move during the height of the London social season, when Parliament was in session and the attention of the entire nation was focused on the capital. She arranged for the evidence to be presented simultaneously to multiple audiences: members of Parliament who could initiate legal proceedings, newspaper editors who could inform the public, and foreign ambassadors who could ensure that the international community was aware of the British government's crimes. The method of exposure was as important as its timing. Rather than simply releasing documents that could be dismissed as forgeries or misinterpretations, Evangeline arranged for a series of dramatic confrontations that would force the guilty parties to reveal their crimes through their own words and actions. The centerpiece of this strategy was a grand ball hosted at Ashworth House, where she invited all the principal figures in the corruption network while secretly arranging for their conversations to be recorded by hidden observers. The evening of the ball marked the culmination of everything that Evangeline had worked toward during her years of dangerous investigation. The grand ballroom of Ashworth House had been transformed into a stage where the final act of the drama would be performed before an audience that included the most powerful individuals in British society. Ladies in gowns that cost more than working families earned in years mingled with gentlemen whose decisions affected the fate of millions, all unaware that they were participating in events that would be remembered by historians for centuries to come. The revelation began when Evangeline rose to address the assembled guests, ostensibly to announce her engagement to Marcus Blackwood, but actually to present evidence that would destroy the careers and reputations of half the individuals present. Speaking with a clarity and authority that commanded the attention of everyone in the room, she detailed the crimes she had uncovered while displaying documents that proved beyond any possibility of doubt that the British government had been systematically betraying the interests of the nation it claimed to serve. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Several guests attempted to flee the ballroom, only to discover that the exits had been quietly secured by agents loyal to the reform movement. Others tried to deny their involvement in the crimes being exposed, but their protests were contradicted by evidence that included their own correspondence and financial records. Lord Chancellor Pemberton attempted to have Evangeline arrested for treason, but discovered that the magistrates he had expected to support him had been presented with evidence of his own corruption and were more concerned with saving their own careers than protecting his. The most dramatic moment of the evening came when Colonel Morrison attempted to shoot Evangeline, drawing a pistol that he had concealed beneath his evening dress and aiming it at her heart as she stood on the raised platform at the front of the ballroom. But Marcus, who had been watching from the musicians' gallery, threw himself between them, taking the bullet that had been intended for the woman he loved. As Morrison was overwhelmed by guests who had finally realized the true nature of the man they had trusted with their nation's security, Marcus collapsed in Evangeline's arms, his life's blood staining the marble floor of the ballroom where they had first met 4 years earlier. But even as she held Marcus's lifeless body and felt her heart breaking with grief that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for rational thought, Evangeline understood that his sacrifice had not been in vain. The shock of witnessing Morrison's attempted murder in front of so many witnesses galvanized support for the reform movement in ways that no amount of documentary evidence could have achieved. The guests who had arrived at Ashworth House as representatives of a corrupt establishment left as committed supporters of the changes that would transform British society. The days that followed the ball saw a series of rapid developments that fulfilled every goal that Evangeline and Marcus had set for their dangerous campaign. Parliament voted to establish a commission of inquiry with full powers to investigate government corruption and prosecute those responsible for betraying the public trust. The Prince Regent, faced with incontrovertible evidence of his own crimes, abdicated his position as heir to the throne in favor of his younger brother, who had remained untainted by the scandals that had destroyed so many of his contemporaries. Most importantly, new laws were enacted that would make future corruption more difficult to conceal and more severely punished when discovered. But for Evangeline, these public victories were overshadowed by the personal cost of achieving them. Marcus's death had robbed her of the only person who had truly understood her and shared her commitment to principles that transcended personal advantage. The knowledge that their work had succeeded in reforming British society provided some comfort, but it could not fill the emptiness that his absence had created in her life. In the months that followed, as the new government implemented the reforms that she and Marcus had died to achieve, Evangeline gradually withdrew from the public arena that had been the scene of her greatest triumphs and most devastating losses. She devoted herself to charitable works that would help the poor and disadvantaged who had suffered most from the corruption of the old system. Her diary, which had begun as a record of scandal and intrigue, evolved into a testament to the possibility of redemption and the power of individuals to change the world through courage and determination. The final entry in that remarkable document, written on the first anniversary of Marcus's death, captured both the sorrow and the hope that characterized her transformed understanding of life and duty. Today I visited his grave and told him that the England we dreamed of is finally becoming reality. The corruption that once seemed so powerful has been exposed and punished, the reforms we planned have been implemented, and the people we sought to protect are finally receiving the justice they deserve. But the price of this victory will haunt me for the rest of my days, because the man who should have shared in our triumph lies silent beneath the marble that bears his name. Yet even in death, he continues to inspire me to use whatever time remains to me in service of the principles we both held dear. For love, true love, does not end with death but transforms into something eternal that gives meaning to every action and purpose to every breath. The gravestone that marked Marcus's final resting place had been carved from the same Yorkshire stone that had built the foundations of Ashworth House, creating a connection that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The inscription, composed by Evangeline herself in classical Latin that only the most educated observers could translate, spoke of love that had conquered both fear and death, of principles that had proved stronger than the forces arrayed against them, and of hope that would inspire future generations to continue the work of reform and renewal. The flowers that Evangeline placed on his grave each week were carefully selected for their symbolic significance. White roses representing the purity of their love, red ones symbolizing the blood that had been shed in the cause of justice, and yellow blossoms that spoke of hope for a future that would vindicate their sacrifice. The arrangements were created by the same florists who had once decorated the ballrooms where she and Marcus had danced, but now their artistry served a different purpose, creating beauty that would honor memory while inspiring continued dedication to the cause that had cost them everything they held dear. The visitors who came to pay their respects at Marcus's grave included not only members of the aristocratic families that had once dominated British society, but also representatives of the new order that was emerging from the reforms that he and Evangeline had made possible. Former mill workers who had been elected to Parliament through expanded suffrage, merchants whose businesses had flourished under the more equitable commercial regulations, and clergymen who had been freed from the corrupt patronage systems that had once controlled ecclesiastical appointments. Each visitor brought their own flowers, their own prayers, and their own memories of how Marcus's sacrifice had changed their lives. The grave had become a pilgrimage site for those who believed that individual courage could triumph over institutional corruption, that love could overcome hatred, and that truth would ultimately prevail over deception. The soil around the gravestone had been enriched by countless tears of gratitude from people whose lives had been transformed by reforms that Marcus would never live to see implemented. Thus ended the diary of Lady Evangeline Ashworth, the woman who had indeed ruined the court but in doing so had saved the soul of an empire. Her story became legend, whispered in drawing rooms and debated in Parliament, inspiring generations of reformers who would continue the work she and Marcus had begun. And though the corrupt world they had challenged was transformed beyond recognition, the love that had motivated their sacrifice remained as a testament to the power of two hearts united in pursuit of justice and truth. The legacy of their love extended far beyond the immediate political reforms that followed their revelations. Universities throughout Britain established scholarships in Marcus's name for students who demonstrated exceptional commitment to public service and moral courage. Evangeline's diary was published posthumously, becoming one of the most widely read books of the 19th century and inspiring reform movements throughout Europe and America. The secret passages beneath Ashworth House were preserved as a monument to the courage of those who had risked everything to challenge oppression and corruption. The British Empire that emerged from this transformation would face new challenges and undergo further changes, but it would never again be the same corrupt system that had seemed so powerful and permanent in the autumn of 1817. For Evangeline Ashworth had proven that even the mightiest institutions could be brought down by truth, courage, and love, and that the most dangerous weapon against tyranny was not a sword or a cannon, but the diary of a woman who refused to accept that the world could not be changed. Her influence extended to the very language of political reform, with phrases from her diary becoming rallying cries for subsequent generations of activists and reformers. The concept of aristocratic accountability that she had pioneered became a fundamental principle of modern democratic governance. The investigative methods she had developed were adopted by journalists and government investigators throughout the world. Most importantly, her example demonstrated that political change was possible through intellectual courage and moral determination, rather than violence and revolution. The reforms that followed her revelations created a new model of governance that balanced traditional institutions with democratic accountability, aristocratic privilege with social responsibility, and individual liberty with collective welfare. The system that emerged was not perfect, but it represented a fundamental improvement over the corrupt and exploitative arrangements that had preceded it. Future generations would build upon the foundations that Evangeline and Marcus had established, creating ever more just and equitable societies that honored the principles for which they had sacrificed everything. The annual memorial service held in Marcus's honor became one of the most important events in the British political calendar, attended by prime ministers and foreign dignitaries who came to pay homage to the memory of two individuals whose love had changed the course of history. The service was held in Westminster Abbey, where the same vaulted ceilings that had witnessed the coronations of kings and queens now echoed with speeches celebrating the triumph of love over corruption, truth over deception, and justice over exploitation.